Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Side Projects. In this one, 5 more lesser talked about ancient marvels, because whenever we make a video like this, it does really well, so I'll just keep making them if you keep wanting them. Though it's the 7 wonders of the ancient world, like the pyramids of Giza and the lighthouse at Alexandria, that get all of the attention, the world is full of lesser known ones that are equally impressive. And in many cases, these ancient marvels that have been relegated to relative obscurity are larger, older, and more significant from cultural, historical, and engineering perspectives. Now, thanks largely to renewed interest in ancient history and technological advances that allow archaeologists and historians to discover and explore new sites without actually spending decades digging, many of them are starting to come to light. But be warned, they may cause you to question much of what you thought you knew about the ancient world. If I asked about the location of the largest city in the Middle Ages, most of us wouldn't waste any time in answering maybe London or Paris or Rome. But this Western-centric view was seriously challenged in the mid-90s when remnants of an epic man-made site were discovered by archaeologists in the primordial jungles of southwest Nigeria. And if their findings are correct, Africans may have built one of the world's largest cities, one that dwarfed the aforementioned metropolises and more than a few modern ones as well. Covered by centuries of vines and vegetation, Eredu has turned much of what historians and archaeologists thought they knew about world and African history on its head, but it's ironically still relatively obscure. Eredu's most prominent and well-preserved features are its moat and defensive wall that's more than 70 feet tall in some places. But more impressively, the wall's circumference is nearly 100 miles, and the area contained within it is nearly 400 square miles. This suggests that it may be among the largest ancient man-made structures on the continent and perhaps in the world. To put those numbers into perspective, at its height, Eredu was about 9 times larger than modern-day San Francisco. The ramparts may have defined the boundaries of the Eredu kingdom ruled by a spiritual leader or Awujale, but though the verdict is still out on whether Eredu was a small kingdom or a massive city, most archaeologists now lean toward the latter, making it infinitely more significant. Radiocarbon dating puts the structures at nearly 1,000 years old, and though they were built thousands of years after the Great Pyramids at Giza, Eredu's builders may have moved 3.5 million cubic yards of earth and stone during construction, or about 3 times more than what was used in the iconic Egyptian pyramid. Likewise, it's estimated that the labor to construct the city's moats and walls took more than 1 million more man-hours to construct than the Great Pyramid. According to local history, the city was built by wealthy and childless Queen Bilikisu Sumbo, which is why it's often referred to as Sumbo's Eredu. Among the site's most important discoveries are a multi-story ruin that's thought to have been the Queen's royal palace that was probably at the center of the complex that included shrines, courtyards, fountains, and living quarters for staff like eunuchs. Historic documents left over from the Portuguese exploration more than 500 years ago suggest that Eredu was an organized and bustling city that derived most of its wealth and power from thriving gold and ivory trades. However, some historians and archaeologists dispute claims that Eredu was the Eredu kingdom, largely because it's believed that the Eredu people were relatively primitive, illiterate, and disorganized, and would therefore have been incapable of such monumental work involving complex planning, logistics, engineering, and craftsmanship. On the other hand, some claim that it's just more evidence of the stereotypes commonly applied to sub-Saharan civilizations by closed-minded experts trapped in the prevailing thought that European and Middle Eastern societies were always more advanced than their African counterparts. Like Eredu in Africa, Dwarka isn't as well known outside India as many of the subcontinent's other ancient marvels, but ironically, it may predate some of them by as many as 5,000 years. Located both in and adjacent to the modern city of Dwarka in the Indian state of Gujarat's western coast, near where the Gomti River empties into the Arabian Sea, ancient Dwarka's partially submerged ruins are among the country's oldest and holiest sites. In Sanskrit, Dwarka means gateway or door, and it's one of 4 chardams or sacred places of pilgrimage for devout Hindus. As the legend goes, the ancient city kingdom was founded by Lord Krishna, one of the religion's major deities. It's mentioned in a number of ancient religious texts, which state that in its heyday, it was home to thousands of individual palaces constructed of silver and precious stones like emeralds. Though excavation didn't officially begin until the mid-1960s, nearly 3 decades before, portions of the site that had remained obscured in more than 100 feet of water were discovered. They contained hundreds of artifacts, including human remains, beads, construction materials, and earthenware, which radiocarbon dating revealed could be nearly 10,000 years old, making them approximately 4,000 years older than those found in the ancient Mesopotamian civilization of Sumeria. Archaeologists believe that before it was inundated by an epic flood about 9,000 years ago, Dwarka was an intricately planned city divided into 6 distinct sectors, much like cities are zoned in developed countries today. Of these, the residential and commercial areas were probably the largest, but all were most likely connected by wide thoroughfares and dotted with parks, gardens, and man-made lakes. Though Dwarka's submerged remains are among the area's most ancient, at just 2,500 years old, the Dwarka Temple, also known as Jagat Mandir, is among the newest, most majestic, and well preserved. The towering limestone temple's main building stands among the country's western tip, where the river Gantia meets the Arabian Sea. Its 5 stories are supported by more than 70 intricately carved pillars, while the stunning and unique pyramid-shaped roof stands nearly 160 feet over the ground below. The temple also includes an ornately adorned sanctum, vestibule, and large central hall with pouches on 3 sides, and on clear days it's possible to see the temple's spire from miles away. The temple's grandeur is enhanced by 56 steps over which the pilgrims must pass before entering the Swarga Dwar gateway, the gateway to the heavens, and exiting the Moksha Dwar, the gateway to liberation, before ultimately ending up on the side edifice along the Ganti's shores. The area is also dotted with equally impressive yet less significant temples, many of which are dedicated to lesser Hindu gods and goddesses. Consisting of 2 completed structures and 1 unfinished one dating back approximately 5,600 years, the Neolithic Gantia temples are located on Gozo, Malta's second largest island, and they predate both the Great Pyramids and Stonehenge by centuries. Built next to one another inside an enclosed wall nearly 20 feet high, the 2 finished temples share an open courtyard and are spread over nearly 10,000 square feet. Of them, the southernmost is the oldest, largest, and most well preserved, and is purported to be the second oldest man-made religious structure in the world after Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Round in shape and containing statues of full-figured goddesses, the Gantia temples were built as simple representations of classic female fertility figures, replete with broad hips and full breasts, which are ever-present symbols of life and fertility in the ancient world. It's thought that the temple's inner sanctums were recreations of the sacred womb, and archaeological evidence suggests that in antiquity their interior walls were painted red to represent blood. Historians believe that the inner spaces may have been the sole realm of priestesses who symbolically entered and exited through a narrow passageway resembling a birth canal. The Gantia temples face towards the point of sunrise on the spring equinox, another reference to rebirth and fertility. In local lore, the temples were built by a giant woman who, after conceiving a child with a common man, set about erecting them with her baby slung on her back. Hence, Gantia is Maltese for Giant's Grotto. At its height, the site probably drew pilgrims not only from Malta, but as far away as North Africa and Mediterranean countries like Italy. At just 20 feet high, the temples may not outwardly appear as particularly impressive feats of engineering, but the largest stones in the complex weigh upwards of 50 tons and were hewn and moved from nearby quarries well before the invention of the wheel and iron tools. Archaeologists theorize that these huge slabs may have been lashed to immense wooden frames and moved into place using cannonball-sized rolling stones, a number of which have been found on site. Officially, the first archaeological work began in the 1820s, when much of the accumulated debris was cleared from the site, but after subsequent excavations that revealed little, the temples fell into further disrepair until it was taken over by the government for protection and restoration. The country appropriated funds for additional excavation between the early 30s and late 50s, and though the megalithic temples were declared UNESCO World Heritage Sites in 1980, restorations continue to this day. Diseased, near-starving, and weary from endless campaigns against tenacious natives, when Hernan Cortez's conquistadors marched into Cholula, Mexico in mid-October of 1519, they were probably relieved to discover that the inhabitants hadn't armed or built defensive structures. Instead, in homage to their numerous gods, they'd constructed a sprawling complex of pyramids. Cortez's records state that the Choluteca had a temple for each day of the year, and it's likely that the residents may have believed that their devotion and piety would protect them against the foreign invaders. But that wasn't the case, and what resulted was an epic bloodbath that left nearly 3,000 Choluteca dead, or about 10% of the city's population. By the time of the onslaught, Cholula was among the largest and most opulent cities in the Aztec Empire, one Cortes called the most beautiful city he'd ever seen, outside of his native Spain, of course. But even then, the largest pyramid in the world was hidden beneath soil and vegetation, making it like just another feature of the natural landscape. The Spaniards settled in Cholula and immediately began erecting their own Christian churches, the most prominent of which, the Iglesia de Nuestra Señora de los Remediosa, was built on what they probably thought was a big grassy hill. And as the story goes, the hill's true identity wouldn't be revealed until the early years of the 20th century, when the construction of an insane asylum began slowly revealing one of the world's most impressive structures. Excavations between the 20s and 60s uncovered the Great Pyramid of Cholula, a structure standing nearly 1,500 feet wide and almost 220 feet tall that claims a number of impressive records. In fact, it's the world's largest pyramid, and though it's less than half as tall as its Egyptian cousin, due to its massive base, the Cholula Pyramid's internal volume is about 160 million cubic feet, compared to just 83 million cubic feet for the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's also the largest monument ever constructed, even to this day, and it's aptly known by the locals as the man-made mountain. But the fact is that it's a number of pyramids, one built atop the previous by a succession of civilization. And though the mud, sand, and straw adobe bricks from which it was constructed are extremely durable, they also provided infinite fertile porous footholds from which all sorts of vegetation adhered easily, hastening its reclamation by the jungle. Construction probably began around 300 BC, and though it hasn't been definitively established who built it, it's thought that the population was a mix of local cultures who came together and grew wealthy from lucrative trade routes that ran through the Mexican highlands, connecting the Tolteca cultures to the north and the Mayans to the south. It was abandoned sometime in the 7th or 8th century AD, and some historians theorize that when it was inhabited again by the Choluteca, they may not have even known about the pyramid's existence. Now, the aforementioned church is apparently the oldest continually inhabited site on the continent, and thanks to recent excavations and restorations, much of it can be explored through a labyrinth of underground tunnels. More than 4,000 years ago, 3 mud brick temples known as Dufufa were built in and around the Nubian capital of Kerma in what's now northern Sudan. The largest of the 3 is 170 feet long, 92 feet wide, and nearly 70 feet tall, and lies at an oxbow in the Nile River known as the Great Bend that millennia ago marked the empire's southern boundary. Now, the ancient Dufufa and the town of Kerma are widely regarded as the site of the earliest African urban center outside Egypt. Even today, Kerma is a bustling community that derives much of its wealth from the river's bounty, though millennia ago it likely featured much more prominently in regional trade, particularly in gold. But though the modern town of Kerma has spread around the impressive structure, the towering Dufufa is still one of its most prominent features, consisting of a number of underground chambers, a large interior space, and a stairway leading to a rooftop platform 5 stories up. The largest Dufufa filled a number of roles in the ancient Nubian city, founded around 2500 BC, and evidence suggests that at that time it was on an island in the Nile. The Dufufa was probably the center of spiritual life in the prosperous town, but it was also a center of defense, and along with the others a few kilometers away, it acted as a necropolis that was the final resting place for tens of thousands of deceased Nubians. Much of what scholars know of early Nubian history comes from ancient Egyptian historical sources, but in the early 20th century, one of the world's foremost archaeologists and Egyptologists, American George Reisner, discovered its significance almost by accident. Traveling south from Cairo at the request of the Sudanese Antiquities Authority in Khartoum, Reisner was unprepared for what he found at Kerma, evidence of a massive and thriving civilization previously unknown to all but locals and a few passing remarks in the texts of European explorers who passed through the area in the mid-19th century. As the head of the joint exploration between Harvard University and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, Reisner had spent years overseeing excavations at the Great Pyramid of Giza, where he repeatedly found evidence of Nubian culture that increasingly captured his interest. It was previously thought that the city was a colonial outpost of Egypt, but Reisner and his team discovered that Kerma was probably an independent and semi-autonomous city, though Pharaoh Thutmose's armies did invade and rule much of Nubia for centuries. But they weren't perpetually vanquished and colonized people, because the Nubians invaded southern Egypt and exerted their power there in the 7th and 8th centuries BC. Thus, the impact of the closely intertwined civilizations are often difficult to distinguish, but it's clear that the Nubians were powerful enough to project forces force and influence on the more well-known civilization to the north. Despite frequent conflict, human remains excavated from the site reveal that the city's residents came from a number of diverse ethnicities, and thanks to the arid climate in which natural mummification is common, many of those recovered were surprisingly well preserved. Though other structures in the area have helped increase the understanding of Nubian culture and civilization, the Western Tufufa in central Kerma is far and away the most significant. And I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that like button below. Don't forget to subscribe. As always, thank you for watching. If you've got a suggestion for a future side project video, please do leave it in the comments below. And thank you for watching.